I'm a little out of a sequence here, but first thing to do once you get the wheels off is to go through and spray all the bolts down with WD-40. Might be a good idea to let them sit for an hour or so. That'll make your life a lot easier. The next step is to jack the car up. You know that I've having some jack problems here. I definitely got to have a jack worked on. The upper check ball is not holding like it should be. You want to get the car up at least 16 inches clear below the bottom of the ball joints. Don't make the same mistake I did and have to jack the car up later. It's much more difficult and not near as safe. Next, you want to break loose both of the caliper mounting bolts. These are 15 millimeter. You're probably definitely going to have to use a breaker bar to do this. Once you get them broke, you can use a ratchet. The next step is to go ahead and pull the brake pads away from the rotor so that you can get the calipers off of the rotor mounts. This is best done with a large C-clamp. You don't have to pull them out all the way, just enough to where you'll be able to get the caliper off. Now you can remove the calipers. You want to make sure that you support the caliper where no pressure is on the brake hoses. It will be real easy to damage the brake hose, which could of course lead to a brake failure. I found several holes in the frame that worked real good for using coat hanger wire to support the calipers. Now it's time to remove the rotor. You'll note that mine still have the locking rings on the lugs that hold the rotor in place during factory assembly. These are strictly a factory item that is used to hold the rotor for convenience as the car is being assembled. You can delete these when you put the car back together. Time to remove the ABS sensor supporting bolt. This is a 1/4 inch bolt. Both a 1/4 inch socket and ratchet and a 1/4 inch box wrench may come in handy here. Next, remove the actual sensor from its mounting hole. This can be kind of slid back out of the hole by wiggling the actual sensor. Once the sensor is clear of its mounting hole, you can now use a 19 millimeter socket to remove the mounting nut that is on the upper strut bolt mount. Here's a shot of my existing ball joints. You note the boots are gone. The only indication that I had something was wrong was a slight groaning whenever I took turns. Now we're going to start working on the ball joints. First off, note that I am using jack stands underneath the A-arms. And to do this, I'm going to jack the car up to where it just barely clears the jack stand. Then I'll use a wrench to back the nut off about 2 turns. I want a 1/16 inch gap between the bottom of the nut and the actual spindle. With factory ball joints, this nut is a 24 millimeter. Here's where it comes in real handy to have both front wheels up off the ground. It's much easier sometimes to break it loose from the front than it would be from the rear. But if you can turn the steering wheel to allow you to attack from both ends, front and rear, it should be much easier to break the ball joint loose. After you break the ball joint loose, you want to lower the car back where the A-arm is sitting firmly on the jack stand. Once you've broken the ball joint, now you got to get your tool back. Generally speaking, I find if you tap on both sides with a hammer, as I'm doing here, it'll loosen up and come out. In this case, I had to back off slightly off the nut to be able to get my tool back. It definitely was wedged in there good. Time to go to work on the strut nuts. These are 24 millimeter. You're going to probably need a breaker bar to break them loose. Once they're break loose again, you can go back with a standard ratchet. The upper strut nuts in the engine compartment were one bad surprise for this job. No matter what I did, I couldn't break the one loose on the passenger side. The one on the driver's side broke loose, but only turns so far. The only option I had here was to go back and use a hacksaw and split the nut and cut it off. This would have been a real bummer if I wasn't replacing the struts, but since it was getting new struts, it wasn't a major issue. Time to remove the tie rod cotter pin. This is a disposable item. Make sure you've got new ones on hand, unless you're replacing the tie rod ends as well. But always use new. Never reuse a cotter pin. Now it's time to break loose the tie rod ends. To do this, you need a special tool. You can pick this up at any auto parts store. They're commonly called a tie rod end breaker. To do this, you run the castle nut up all the way to the top of the bolt, then insert the tool at the bottom of the spindle, being sure that you don't damage the boot. You can use a screwdriver to roll the edge of the boot back so that you can get the tool in. Once you have the tool correctly installed, you need to tighten the bolt. The bolt will be held in place by the top of the castle nut, and then of course the bottom of the tool presses up against the spindle. It should break free after just a couple of turns, as I've shown here. Once it breaks free, just manually loosen the nut the rest of the way, and the tie rod end should drop out. The tie rod nuts are 19 millimeter. The tie rod breaking tool is also 19 millimeter. Now it's time to remove the ball joint nut. You'll note I had to use vice grips to hold the ball joint shaft in place. It would rotate as I tried to loosen the nut if I didn't. Once the nut is free, you can remove the vice grip. I also had to do some minor bending on the shield to be able to get it to clear the A-arm. Then you can just bend it back in shape once you've got the spindle off. My shields were riveted in place, so I elected to leave them on instead of remove them and then reattach them at a later time. Before you put the press on the ball joint, it's a good idea to take a wire brush to clean it up thoroughly. Then go back and spray it down real good with WD-40. Here's a quick ball joint press tutorial. Note the adapter that has the larger hole goes up on top of the ball joint, and the ball joint stem slides through the adapter. Note the medium cup is used. It just barely fits over the ball joint on the bottom so that you can press the ball joint back into the cup. Note the adapter that has the smaller hole goes at the bottom. The shoulder indentation goes next to the screw for the press. Here's my first trial with the ball joint press. You'll note that it is extremely hard to move the breaker bar. After I tried this very briefly, I went back and decided I had to make some changes. I used wheel bearing grease on the threads of the press, and they came out without any problem. But you must lubricate the threads on your press. Otherwise, it's almost impossible, even with a breaker bar, to get this thing to work. Now I'm ready to press out the old ball joint. Note that I've got a lot of lubrication on threads, and I'm using my half-inch breaker bar. You'll note that it's turning much easier than before now that I've lubricated the threads. Ball joint just dropped free, dropped into the cup. Now I'll take off the press. And you note my ball joint was really wore out. It moves very freely, indicating that it was in dire need of replacement. Here's another look at the press now that I've got the ball joint out. Here's how it all goes together. This one goes next to the large hole on the press. And the ball joint shaft goes through this larger hole. And here's what it looks like laid out flat. Note the only real difference between putting one in and taking one out is the cup just moves from the bottom to the top. Okay, that's it for the teardown. The next video will cover putting it all back together.